Welcome to A Fresh Face in Hell. I'm your host, Jonathan Evison. Every week we talk to somebody new and interesting, somebody intellectually curious, somebody who will hopefully renew our faith in this cold, cruel world we live in. A Fresh Face in Hell. Welcome to A Fresh Face in Hell with Jonathan Evison. That's me, Jonathan Evison. My guest today is one of my very favorite conversationalists. He's open, he's candid, he's even a little bit vulnerable. He is a longtime veteran journalist and beloved sports radio personality, and he is Danny O'Neill, coming to us from the Upper West Side of Manhattan today. How are you, Danny?
I'm doing very well, Jonathan. That's a little flattering to describe, but your introduction it makes me blush a little bit. So thank you very much.
Good. See, he's vulnerable already. Now, me and Danny are going to talk about Grudges today because Danny is a little obsessed with Grudges, and I never thought I was a begrudging person until I started having long conversations with Danny about Grudges, and I realized that I kind of am. So we're going to talk about that too. Danny is so obsessed with Grudges that he has a newsletter called Grudgery, which I am a subscriber and I read weekly, in which Danny really breaks down not only his personal grudges, but but everything we're going to kind of break down in the show here today. So, to start with, Danny, where did this whole thing with Grudges start? Where does your preoccupation with Grudges begin?
Well, I think it starts with me being slightly proud of my ability to hold grudges and realizing that was a part of my personality that I wasn't necessarily ashamed of. And I would tell people that, hey, I probably should be more embarrassed about this than I am, but I hold grudges. And it wasn't until relatively recently, I would say 3 years ago, where I came to realize that this was posing a problem for me in some interpersonal relationships, and specifically that my inability to get over feeling slighted had kind of become a little bit of a burden that I was dragging around, and it was influencing my ability to move past when other people harmed me. And it does date back to what is a pretty seminal relationship in my life with my stepfather. But I would say at first, I would just say, I've got a grudge against the Oklahoma City Thunder. I hope they never win a game again. And if they do, I to this day will root against them, and I want their losses to be as painful as possible. I have a grudge against A-Rod. I currently have a little bit of a grudge against the Seattle Mariners. It's a lot of sports things because I deal with a lot of sports. And I would have said that those are harmless. And I still think they largely are. But I also had grudges against people who were actual people or former friends that I came to realize were not harmless. And over the course...
Yeah, those ones are tricky.
Yeah.
The sports ones are kind of part of fandom in a way. I mean, I'm still a begrudging of the Yankees just because the Griffeys didn't like them. But when it gets interpersonal like this, as it started with your stepdad, now it starts to get a little dicey.
Having to figure out how to move on from things. Because, part of life is that we come across people who either hurt our feelings or do things that are actually have negative consequences on our life. And the question of how you move on from that, I think usually we try to find some sense of closure. And that's easier in some situations than others. And then for me, there was something that happened with my stepfather that there was no closure to it. And so I just kept carrying that around, and I continued to seethe about that. And I definitely believe that those sort of things are unhealthy, whereas a grudge against A-Rod is fairly harmless.
Yeah, well, how is there no closure?
So...
Did he die?
He did not die. He did not. So my father died when I was 13, and my mom remarried fairly quickly. And my stepfather was someone I was 15 when they remarried. I didn't really get along with him when I was in high school, but I got through high school. I never ran away. I never really even had a knockdown, drag-out argument with him. I moved away to go to college. I went to the University of Washington. By that point, my family was living in California. And when I was in my late 20s, there was a series of events where his professional and personal life collapsed. He was a school district superintendent, and there was a fairly well-publicized spending scandal. He was driving a $80,000 BMW sedan as a public school employee. There were stories in the San Jose Mercury News. There were TV news reports. There's actually a 7-minute TV report I have from the local ABC affiliate.
And you know it's 7 minutes because you've watched it like 11 times. Like, I didn't even know how long it is.
Oh, yeah. I didn't see it for a long time. I saw that within the last 3 years as I've been working on this project. It's really funny. Like, I howl laughing watching it.
All 7 minutes and 12 seconds.
Yeah, there's some pretty good segments in there. And that professional collapse occurred at the same time he was going through and separated from my mom. And it turned out that he had been unfaithful to her. He had really kind of broken her heart and then never been honest about it. And then he was never honest with any of my family about what had happened. So I was really mad at him. I saw him one time after they divorced, and he came up and expected me to hug him. It was at my brother's college graduation. I have a younger brother and a younger sister. I hated that, but I did it because I didn't want to make a scene. I've always resented doing that. He would occasionally email me, say like, how are you doing? I'd never respond. I was just always going to dislike him because of what he'd done. My family had arranged itself around him. He had moved us from Oregon to California. He had been a generally difficult person for me to be around, had been what I thought was overly strict. I thought I had been a pretty accepting teenager. Of course, I'm a teenager.
Well, I mean, it sounds if you didn't hate him until you were in your 20s, it sounds like you. I mean, I started hating the first when my stepdad married. My mom remarried after my dad left us. My dad kind of moved us up here and then left. And it was I was maybe a year or two younger than you. I think I was about 12, 13. And the first thing that happened when he moved into our house was that the dog, who had formerly been an indoor dog its whole 11-year life, started sleeping outside. And me, 12 or 13 at the time, started sleeping in a room attached to the garage. So we were both sort of like kicked out of the house. It was just kind of like all of a sudden, things changed. And I to this day still have a grudge. I mean, I still, he's probably going to listen to this podcast. He did a lot of nice stuff for me over the years. But I have a problem where a lot of my grudges go even beyond me. Like my producer, Jason, whom you just met when we did the test. Some people have screwed him around that I can't forgive. He's even forgiven them. And I'm like, nope, that person's dead to me. And I got to talk him into having a grudge.
So I think those sort of things are reflections of your empathy and your loyalty, right? I actually think most grudges, often come from a good place of wanting justice and fairness and people to treat the people that you love with fairness and equity, to be respectful of them. The other part is people will say, and I think this is generally true, that grudges are negative. Carrying around that kind of negative energy is bad for you, but it's also very natural. We're animals. And if you talk about revenge is terrible, right? There's all sorts of books. The Count of Monte Cristo. I mean, one of the dominant themes in literature is that revenge is a toxin. It's a poison. It gets captured within your thrall. It leads you to do things that you regret. I think some of that part is true. I do think you can become obsessed with revenge.
But grudges aren't quite revenges.
It's potential revenge, right?
Yes.
It's potential revenge. And we catch ourselves of saying, like, I know I shouldn't do this. So with my stepfather, I was a newspaper journalist. I thought to myself for years and fantasized about this, like very specifically, writing about the things he had done, the way my mom found out he'd been unfaithful, the way he denied it, how he strung her along, how hard he made it for her, writing about that. And part of that was revenge. I wanted him to be held accountable for what he did. I didn't do that because I know revenge is bad. It's you don't want to go down that path because it will lead you to do things that you regret. But then you still, if you don't process that negative feeling that you have, that's the grudge, then you just kind of hold on to it. And that's kind of what I did for 20 years was I had this pool of potential revenge that I wasn't acting on, but it wasn't getting smaller.
So the newsletter is almost kind of therapeutic for you.
I would say the newsletter...
Or does it get you more riled up?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. The newsletter has come out of the process of coming to grips with my grudge. and because I'm like full peek behind the curtain. I've already talked to my stepfather. I had not spoken to him in 20 years. I've talked to him. I've gone and interviewed him. I'm fine, and emotionally, I consider myself at a pretty settled place. I don't have a grudge against him. But the newsletter is writing about this process and then also using other examples from our world to kind of talk about some of the things that I've seen and come to understand. I thought for a long time I would need to confront him to get closure. That the only way to get through this was to have this knockdown, drag out. You hurt me this. You shouldn't have done this. You're a dirty so-and-so. And what it turned out was that finding closure is what allowed me to talk to him. And I'm glad that it went that way, because when we talked, there was nothing that was said that would have made me okay with what had happened. There was no mea culpa and, oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so you're saying, so there has been closure, but it's only on your end. There's been no,
Yeah.
he never offered his olive branch, but you feel like you've resolved it, but yet you haven't. I mean, if we're being honest, I mean, I believe you. Like, I have a friend who had slept with my first wife. Okay, he was a friend, an old friend, and he had an affair with my ex-wife, which ended up actually being kind of a favor to me because she didn't want to have kids and I wanted to be a dad. And so, like, I mean, my life went nowhere but up from that day, actually, even though it was the worst 2 years of my life. I was in a total blur. I was really literally traumatized by it because I thought, this is the person I'm going to grow old with. And I've forgiven that guy, but I still have boundaries. This guy, he's like, hey, Steve's coming down. We're going to go see the Circle Jerks, man. You should come down, stay at my place. Let's go to the show. And I'm like, no. You know what I mean? It's like, come on, dude, really? I mean, I'll forgive you. I've accepted the fact that this happened, and I've even admitted that it worked out well for me. But I mean, the presumption of like, oh, it's just going to be like normal, never. So like even grudges, even when we disarm them, they're still kind of stratified, I feel like there's still boundaries. Like I'm never going to get back. I had another guy that screwed me up in business. He really screwed me up on a business deal, and we were on the same career path, and he kind of ran for the pot of gold, and it didn't work out, but like it was pretty clear he made the steps, and he's my friend and I've forgiven him, but I'm not going to invite him for an overnighter, but I mean, there's going to always be limits to that. So like, I think there's some things, if they're worthy of begrudging, there are some transgressions that they're kind of irredeemable on some level.
I would agree with you. And you used a word there, and I think it's something that I've come to believe. And it was a therapist that told me this, not one of the therapists I've seen. I've been in therapy for more than 20 years at this point. It was from someone else that I interviewed.
I've needed to be in therapy for more than years.
I generally think we could all benefit from therapy. I do want to say too, like that's the idea of having one of your friends, like your wife, be unfaithful with one of your friends. That's crushing, and I'm really sorry that happened.
Like I said, it's actually the best thing that ever happened to me.
Yeah, but that's still like what you said.
But I'm still not ready to forgive. Like, dude.
Well, that question of what constitutes forgiveness is interesting, because I think there is an image, and I would argue some of this comes from sort of the New Testament teaching of turn the other cheek, that you're supposed to just forget that something happened. And I actually think that that's incorrect. I don't. I believe that you should remember what happened, if only to prevent and protect yourself from having something similar happen again. I think boundaries are good. And just because you have a boundary doesn't mean that you haven't forgiven the person. Having a boundary reflects sort of your experience with what happened and not wanting to go through something like that again. Sort of when someone shows you who they are, believe them. And for me, the difference between a boundary and a grudge is the negative emotion that it causes you to experience. So if I still had a grudge against my stepfather, when I talked about him, I would still be like, man, I really want to spell out exactly what happened, and I want everybody to know how bad he was.
Our listeners do too, Danny. So feel free to unload. You can make one exception.
Yeah. And instead, what I do feel like is that I've learned something about myself and how to handle something that was a very difficult and traumatizing event. And I'm not going to put myself in position to be hurt by that person again. I'm not going to be friends with him. I don't know if I'll ever speak to him again. I'm not against it or ruling it out, but I don't have an emotional charge. I don't expect anything from him, and I won't put myself in position to ever expect anything from him. And I say that based on everything I've seen from his behavior, both when he was married to my mom and afterward. I think I know what to expect from him, which is that he is an irredeemably selfish person. And he got that way probably by going through some very traumatic experiences himself in his upbringing. But I don't have to take on any of that. I don't have to explain or look at it. I don't even have to decide whether he's a good or a bad person. He's just not someone that is going to be a factor in my life anymore.
Well, and you and I, to lump us together here, are both kind of empaths. So, I mean, it's particularly important for us and particularly hard for us to draw those boundaries because both you and I are people. I mean, we haven't even known each other that long, but we've just had intense conversations. So we're both people that can develop that intimacy really quick. We're both very open, candid, and, overshare, which makes us vulnerable. And when you continually run into people in life, and they don't all have to necessarily be on the far narcissistic spectrum, but like 50% of people you really can't trust with that. I would have put that number a lot lower like 8 years ago, but now I'm like, there's about 50% people I can't trust. So now I'm starting to put the boundaries up beforehand, which is no, as you know, that's hard. That's just not our nature. We're outgoing, we're people, and we want to find the best in people, I think, generally, and we share, but I guess I've learned how to figure out right within 5 minutes if I can trust the person. Like if I'm sharing and they're not sharing back, even if they're asking questions like they're more curious, it tells me something about them, like they're at least curious people and they really want to know. But that can also be a different kind of sign, like maybe they're just, I don't know. I just think people like you and I who are open-hearted about this stuff can really we risk a lot of damage. I think we lack a sort of control, emotional control that some people have. And you use that word expectation. And I think that's a big part of it, is just to manage our own expectations. I no longer necessarily I always look for the best in people, but I no longer expect it. I used to expect 9 out of 10 people to be decent people, ever since I saw like All Quiet on the Western Front, and they start playing baseball on the front lines. I'm like, I think people are genuinely good, like 9 out of 10, and like sort of categorically had to lower that number decade by decade. And part of that is geo-global politics and just how late capitalism, how the culture is changing. But part of that is me getting older and just like learning lessons. And what I fear, the one I'm afraid of, is part of it is me getting older and more closed off.
Yeah, I would say that resonates with me, of that idea of being closed off and worrying that you don't give people the benefit of the doubt or leave them room to surprise you, and that you potentially cut off enriching relationships because of that, or just by being more measured in your expectations, that you leave less room for that kind of engagement that really is stimulating. Because what you said, I do feel there's a chemistry in our friendship, and it's energizing to me. And I do thrive in those sort of collaborative and communal environments. But when you do come up against somebody and have and operate in that way, and they are more self-interested or even ruthlessly self-interested, it can be very hurtful. And I don't know the perfect answer to that, other than to say that kind of as we go through life, I do think we begin to understand and recognize where boundaries can be set and what makes us, like, it's okay to say, I want to be around people that make me feel good about myself. I don't like having conversations where I feel like they're a vampire sort of sucking out my life energy so they can take part or feel some sort of connection where I'm like, I don't, but no, it's part of the challenge of being alive, I think. And as you get older, I would agree with you though, that you want to make sure that you don't lose that sort of enthusiasm or that joy for those unexpected discoveries and connections that you can make.
Yeah, well, there are snakes out there too, okay? Bill Clinton, okay? Now, I can't say it for certain, but I'll tell you a story. I once went to a respite care. I was a keynote speaker at a respite care conference in Boston, all right? Like, I give the keynote speech because I was, I wrote the Revised Fundamentals of Caregiving, which was about caregiving, and I was a caregiver for years, an in-home care provider. And the year before I was there, Bill Clinton had given the keynote speech. So clearly there was a drop-off there, But all weekend long in Boston, I met it was like 80% women, 90% women. I met some friends I still have, just great ladies. And we went around Boston and had coffee and drank beer, but separately, 4 different women, maybe even 5 different women that weekend told me, just unsolicited, Bill Clinton is the sexiest man I've ever met. I'm like, really? That big peanut head? You got to be kidding me. I mean, I guess he's handsome for a president, but, JFK is a big blockhead too. I just don't see it. Right. And I go, well, because I'm curious. I'm like, well, tell me about it. What did he do? And this is kind of creepy. They all kind of reported the same thing. He looked right down in their face with his big old, talking in his soft bubble voice. And he would look right down in their voice and look really engaged and nodding and act really engaged and asking questions, short questions, but then nodding and acting very interested. But the one creepy part that I think is that he would lightly touch their thigh, just barely, like he would reach out, and lightly rest a hand on their thigh. This is a little before Me Too or whatever, but I don't know how well that would play. But now here's a guy imbued with such charisma that I'm like, oh God, me or you would probably just pour our heart out of that guy. Plus, he bowls a 237 4 years from the last time he bowled, plays a pretty good alto sax. Here's a guy that's actually dangerous to people like you and I. He could lure us in but clearly he's a man who's driven by self-interest. So you got to watch out for those people.
Absolutely. And that's really funny because I wonder, whenever I see someone like that, because there is a thing as charisma, right? Like when you're in a room with someone that does create a spark with people, but there's also sort of what I think of as sort of refined acts where they've got a certain pattern or series of gestures that they do because they know it works. And I always think about it as you're kind of like this science researcher. You had a hypothesis of let's see if a light touch on the wrist works. Nope, that doesn't. In my experience, the light touch to the thigh works 5x better than the light touch to the wrist. We're going to institute the thigh touch as the finishing. And where it's man, it's this social science designed seduction machine. It's wild.
I mean, I think we can all relate to having, I do all these speaking gigs and I hit my talking points. I know what works. I'm not going to lose a crowd before I know I got one of my lines that I know will bring them back. You know what I mean? So we all have a kind of default to that, to a certain amount of social charm. But what was interesting to me is to have it on such a level that 5 people would separately say to that. I mean, it made me wonder, have I ever even been around that kind of charisma? I mean, these ladies were under a spell.
Yeah. Let me transition though, because I've told you this before. One of the things I love about your writing career is how different your books are. That each book is its own world. And in hearing you talk about Bill Clinton and that what he's doing is the equivalent of a serial, right? Like a series of similarly formatted plot lines. He's got a series of beats that he performs to get a desired emotional reaction. And that is so at odds with how your literature, your writing works. But I would say it's also so at odds with how you live and to a certain extent how I live. My absolute nightmare was having a job that got repetitive, was having a job where I felt I'm doing the same thing each and every day. I know exactly the pattern. It was why I left being a newspaper reporter and covering the Seattle Seahawks. It's why that I ultimately left sports radio on a daily basis, is because it started to feel generic. Like I had my act down, and that's not fun. It's not fun for me to perform something that's entirely segmented. There has to be some spontaneity and some like that's the enjoyment part of me, is figuring out how to do it.
And when you're putting yourself out there, I mean, talk about, I mean, I've said it before, like, if I've worked in some arenas where I've used my talents to an end I didn't like, I'm not a big fan of advertising, but I'm a conscientious worker and I'll always do my best. But I'm kind of feel like the whole time, like, Jesus, I'd rather be cleaning septic tanks, because at least my thoughts would be free from, you know what I mean? At least it doesn't take my freedom away. And so it becomes hard when you're doing a job which you ostensibly like. You like being a journalist. You liked being on radio. You have the personality for it. But like when it doesn't, when the end result is not married to the impetus, then it becomes, it's torturous. And that's how I would feel if somebody said, well, why don't you just write a splashy romance novel? First of all, I don't think I could, because it would be the most, fucked up, subverted, twisted, weird romance ever. And so that huge audience that I'm supposed to be getting would be like, no, So I'll admit I don't have the skill set, but to even try it, even once I had this book, The Dream Life of Huntington Sales, which was as much of a mess as it sounds. I mean, the book had all these divergent, some of the best world building characters, settings I've ever created. But it had these divergent themes of like UFOs and country music and commercial logging. It was just a mess. And ultimately the center wouldn't hold. And I found out, I did some narrative archaeology and figured out, because there was really no thesis. There was no like one passage that spoke to that was the heart of the novel. And in all my other books, it was there. That's how I knew, my intuitive feeling that the center didn't hold was exactly right, because the center is the heart, and there was none. So what I did is I figured that I struggled on that thing 3 times with my editor, reinventing it. Now it's kind of a noir. Now it's we're going to go this way a little bit with it. I'm going to change from first person to close third. It started to feel like a sausage making operation. And so I pulled the plug without telling him. And that's when Lawn Boy was born. It's like, I got to write something now, because I'd already been paid and I was afraid to tell him it was my decision. I'm not going to finish this novel. Well, fast forward about 5 years later, because the thing's kind of bugging me, because I know that there's some great stuff there. I figured it out. I fucking cracked that thing out in the garage. I had like 20 pieces of, I spent a week out there just breaking it down, all the minutia, every beat by beat, everything. And I figured out how to make it work and be cohesive. And then I'm like, I'm done here. I couldn't even start it. It's like now I had an outline. I literally had like an outline to write the book, and I couldn't do it just because I felt like I was going through the motion, because I lost that spark. I lost that impetus. Like, you got to have that excitement.
It's such a fascinating part of creativity. Like those are the sort of things that I really feel are kind of the juice of life, of how you figure out or get to a point where you're like, oh, I get it. And now I want to communicate it. And a lot of different things have to come together for it to be that way. I know the moment that I had decided, I was like, I've got to leave. I can't keep doing this newspaper job. So in 2012, the Seattle Seahawks were playing a road playoff game against Washington. They were still their nickname was still the Epithets, the Redskins. And I knew that the Seahawks hadn't won a road playoff game since 1983. They went on the road, they beat Dan Marino, and it was this game. And I knew that there had been something that happened with the team plane when they were flying to Miami. The flight had gotten delayed. They had to spend time in a SeaTac airport hotel. They ended up landing at midnight in Miami. They played at 12 the next day. It was just this big mess. So I was like, oh, that'll be a fun little turn back the clock story about they haven't won a road playoff game since this happened. And I do some interviews. I talked to Joe Nash, who was a player on that team. I think I tried to talk to Chuck Knox, who was the coach, but he was, at that point, I don't think he was well enough to do interviews. I talked to a couple other people. And before I go to write it, I'm like, I better look up and make sure I haven't mentioned this before. I do an archive search. 2 years earlier, I had written the exact freaking story. 2 years. I had even talked to Chuck Knox that time. I had zero memory of it. And it scared the freaking hell out of me, because I was like, I am becoming such a piece of repeating shit that I'm just regurgitating things that I don't remember writing. Like, I've already solved that problem, but I've flushed it from my memory. So in a couple months from then, I took a job with the radio station, because I was like, I need to do something different.
Well, how are you going to avoid that with grudgery? I mean, how long can you write a newsletter with the subject of Grudges as the, because I know part of your plan is there's a book in here eventually, like on the subject, and you're kind of feeling it out. This is sort of your testing ground for this. But how do you avoid? Is the subject just so endlessly? I mean, to me, it's fascinating enough that we can go on it for an hour, no problem. But like, how do you avoid?
It's a good question. I don't know. I have resisted the urge to just write a serial story of my relationship with my stepfather and say, here's what it's like when he came in. I remember him being at our house the day we buried my dad. He remembers it that day. Here's what he says. And going through the whole thing of how and why I got mad and how long I stayed mad and then how I resolved it. I've kind of done one-off. The one that I'm publishing next is about Michael Oher, who was the subject of The Blind Side, the book and the movie. And he's now got a grudge against the family that had taken him in large part because of how his story was subsequently told, both in the book and in the movie. So I'm trying to find examples in culture, whether it's business, sports, arts and entertainment, movies, to show different elements of grudge holding, the costs, and then ultimately trying to show ways how people get over it, also talking to therapists. But it's a good question. I don't know how long I want to do it.
Well, you answered part of it just by saying you're bringing in other people.
Yeah.
And so already you've lost the interiority. It's like, how long is Danny going to be grinding this X with his stepdad? You're talking about it in broader terms.
Yeah, because that's definitely true. You can't, there's a limit how much even I want to talk about myself.
Yeah. Well, I can't find that limit. I will just keep doing it, and then I'll just go home. I'll do it all the time. I overshare in front of people, and it's like, oh my God, did I just tell 200 people in a theater that I was struggling with erectile dysfunction? And they like it, of course, because they like the vulnerability. But then I go home to my hotel room and I'm like, Jesus, dude, what are you doing? How many times are you going to talk about that kid you jerked off in 4th grade in front of a crowd?
So it's interesting. You said that to me last time we talked too.
Yeah, see, I say it every time I talk to anybody. I guess maybe I'm ashamed.
No, it's not that.
It wasn't a very good hand job.
No, not that story. But the idea that sharing part is hard for you. What I've found is that sharing things actually takes some of the sting out of it for me. When I quit drinking 7 years ago, and when I talked about it on the radio, which I wasn't even sure I was going to do, I just kind of did it, I felt better about that. I find sharing those things, what you would consider to be even shameful things, to be something that takes the charge out of it, the sting out of it a little bit. And I do think that it builds bonds with people, because when you are vulnerable, people resonate to that. But when you said that, because I found myself thinking, I was like, oh God, that must be really hard, because you don't want to be doing something that makes you feel worse about yourself. Your openness is one of the things that I absolutely love about you.
Well, and same with you. I think the thing we have in common here is curiosity. But and in order to mine into somebody else's vulnerability or their curiosity, or get the best of them. I mean, this is something I as a podcaster, and I had a brief flash in the pan career in radio too. Yeah. And it's one of the things you learn about interviewing people and talking to people. Speaking of boundaries, right? I mean, you talk to them for a little while and it's pretty clear when you've got, like athletes particularly, right? I mean, they're basically briefed and taught to speak in cliches. Don't give up too much. You don't want to be too personal. It may cause problems in the clubhouse. So they're taught to do these interviews rote. And so you have to learn how to disarm them, or, and with somebody like you or me, it's just like, hi. And we're off to the races. You know what I mean? We're like the people that just keep asking questions till people open up, and then just somebody says to us oh, hey, do you know what time it is? And then the next thing you know, I'm telling them about my erectile dysfunction on a street corner. And then I hate myself, because I burden them with that information, because that can't be comfortable for them, even if they kind of like it, wow, that's kind of weird. This guy's kind of vulnerable, but it's got to be uncomfortable.
See, I want to try and fix this part of it, because I don't think it's uncomfortable. And I think that sort of reaction that you're having to that is is not necessarily you're right. Like it's not necessarily an objective feeling, because my reaction when someone shares TMI things or something that people might say is TMI, my feeling is like, oh, we're actually getting to the good stuff here. We're going to interact and we're going to relate at a level where this isn't entirely about saying what is expected. We're actually sharing, because everybody's got crap in their life, right? Like everybody's got crap. And I don't think not talking about the crap or hiding the crap makes the crap feel any less crappy. And so when people share, my reaction is like, oh, I've got an honest connection here. Like this is something like I gravitate toward that, not because I'm a voyeur or because, but I'm like, no, this person wants to really talk about what it's like to be alive.
Yeah, and I mean, as a novelist, that's my job, report on the human condition. So, and it's interesting because like when you're saying that, like when people open up and you have that conversation, it's a great conversation, but it doesn't necessarily make great dialogue. What makes great dialogue is when the reader knows that thing is in between two people like an elephant, and all they do is talk around it, and you can feel it in between and create this sort of vacuum of tension, but it's still there. It's still there. You're just not directing it head on. And that's what I try to teach people about dialogue. It's not really about, it's a little bit about the similitudes of the spoken word, but it's good dialogue is not the same as a good conversation. Like me and you can have a great philosophical conversation, but, read the, if you read the transcript, it's not necessarily going to be jumping off the page like Harold Pinter, because we talk in long, we're talking in long spiraling way, and dialogue's got to be shooting back and forth.
It's so funny that difference between conversation and dialogue, because conversation is I go, you go, I go, you go. And good dialogue is that watching and being able to see two people navigate that little space between them, that what they're sharing and what they're not sharing.
Yeah, and because both people want something. It's an exchange.
Yeah.
Both people want something. Like when you're just having a curious conversation, like we've had many, there's nothing at stake. I'm not trying to get anything from Danny. You're not trying to get anything from me. And so they're, let's hope for our listeners they're pleasurable, because there's no tension. It's more like a mutual admiration society. But I do think, I think if everybody would talk this way, most people I talk to are just what I would call biologists. They're just waiting for their turn to talk. It's like I tell a story and then you just see their mind spinning. They're not even really listening to you. They're just they just can't wait to say, because they got a story like that. And that's the difference. You can be an entertaining person and not be a good conversationalist, because it's shtick. Comedians, ever talk to a comedian? They're just looking for a transition to drop that punchline.
Yeah, and I would say that a lot of the people that I ran into while I was working in radio, they're outputters. They don't do much input. They don't listen. And some of that's the nature of the job, because your job is to project and create a persona that other people feel through, without any video element, through just your words. But it doesn't lend itself to being empathic or really trying to understand the person you're talking to, because all you're worried about is what you're outputting.
Right. And when you bring in professionalism into this conversation, you're adding this, element of competition. Okay. So like some of I've been really trying to grow. I really enjoyed our conversation a couple weeks ago in New York, which had some of the same shape as this, but like I've been really making a conscious effort to just let go of some of my more petty grievances, because I just got so much baggage. I got 3 kids. I got a career now. I got a podcast. It's like some of them take a little weight, collectively, if I could get rid of like 50 smaller grievances, it would just create a little bandwidth. But I know, and I want to talk about, I know that you had one particular professional grudge, but I have a bunch of them, and I'm going to try to talk about a few of them without naming names, because I don't want to shit the nest,
Yeah.
But like there was one writer. Okay, so in when you write novels, there's this thing blurbing. You got to have a quote because until your book comes out into hardback, you don't really get any reviews. That's when the newspapers review it and stuff. So when you get the paperback, it'll say blah blah blah. It says the New York Times or all this hyperbolic stuff, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. But when you do the hardback, you have to have other authors do it. Usually it's authors like on your level or maybe a little higher or bigger. You're shooting as big as you can. And I blurb like 200 books a year, by the way, or not 200 books a year, but like 20 books a year. I blurb well over 200 books in all my years. So I'm one of the few people that's generous about that because I know what it means. I'll be honest with you. Sometimes I don't have time to read the book. My wife has to read it, but I'm just trying to help a brother out, I mean, it's just like, because I know they need it. It's a necessary evil. It's a horrible ask. I don't like to have to ask for my own blurbs, and I don't like to have to say yes to everybody else's, but, I'm just not good at saying no. Well, so what happens is I've had people whose books I've blurbed even multiple times, and then they turn me down. And I'm like, oh, ouch. There was one person who not only I helped them get through the book, they were lost in the book, and I helped get them through the book. I talked them off the ledge many times. I even suggested they change the name of the novel and said, yes, this other one, you said that's the one you should go with. I did a number of events where I hosted the person to launch their book. I blurbed the book. In fact, the editor, they made some broadsides of the cover. Broadside is just like a printed graphic thing and frame. They made broadsides, 100 broadsides for VIP people, and I got number 2. This person's editor got number 1. Okay, that's how high on the chain I was to this person. The writer himself got like number 29 or something. And I asked that person for a blurb, and they just gave me a really pretentious sort of blanket no, like they just found the process odious. I don't do that anymore. And it's like, dude, I mean, I should have realized it's not, is the word quid pro quo or whatever. I mean, I don't expect a favor every time I do one, but God, there's certain instances like, hey, dude, remember that time you were in cardiac arrest and I gave you mouth to mouth and you saved your life? And then you say, no, you know what I mean? Like, so I'm trying to let go of that because it's a person I actually do like on another level, but I know that the person has a selfish streak in them. And I should have known that. I kind of knew that the first time I met them. So I should have set up my boundaries better. First of all, those boundaries are clearly there now, but I can't quite let go of the grudge. And I know there's some jealousy too, but yeah, you interject, please, before I say too much.
No. So I think that this is a good one because I would say, and maybe this is an idea that I'll use going forward. If I had a rule, one of my first rules about grudges is what we say we're mad about isn't usually what we're actually mad about. This grudge is not about a blurb, right? The grudge, the blurb is generally immaterial. That's a symptom or sort of the tangent. What's really going on here is that...
Ouch. I'm probably a little jealous. Ouch.
Oh, no. See, I don't think that's... I mean, there might be a little bit. We'll get to that in a second.
Therapy with Danny O'Neill.
Yeah,
thanks, buddy.
Because I would say the part of it, the bulk of it is what you did for his benefit. And it was not about any self-interest on your part. It was about really wanting him to succeed and get through and have a successful sort of career in words, to be able to sort of stay on the path he's on. And because you're in the business, the impact that your help had. Like you've seen that. And you feel after all of that this is a pretty small penny ante request. And we all know that this is kind of annoying. So the fact that you're turning this down, for you, it reflects a lack of appreciation on this other author's part for the assistance that you've provided. And
that makes me feel less like Mother Teresa.
Well,
but the goal is to feel, I mean, I should do that. Those sort of altruistic things need to be done. They need to be done without unconditionally, right? And I didn't know, I was doing them unconditionally. I thought like the acts of generosity were unconditional, but now I have to face the fact that I guess maybe after the fact there were sort of conditions. And so
no.
I didn't even ask the person to read the book. I just said blurb it. You know what I'm saying? If they would have sent me the book the night before it went to press, I'd say, because they were ostensibly a friend. I mean, at least somebody I'd closed a bunch of bars down with, had a lot of funny conversations, helped through books, talked creative process. I would have just said, look, tell me what you want me to say. No sweat off my back. But I think it was that there was an element of pretension to it. Like, I just can't put my name on other people's books. And that was off-putting to me.
Now, so grudges are not good or bad. Grudges just are. This is not, because when you describe this to me, this is a totally understandable grudge. 100%. And I would not judge it as, hey, you're overreacting. Like, no, man. Like, that's a friend. You asked him for a small favor and he was pretentious about it. It's totally understandable why it would be there. The question about it isn't, do you have the right to feel like you do? Of course you do. It's your feelings. You're going to feel that way. Is it helpful for you? Does it help you to have that negative feeling? Now, I would say that the helpful part here would be to understand when this individual X is asked for help, I can't rely on him providing it.
Right, but I've already got that information.
So
now,
and now kind of the, how do you take the sting or the emotional where you just say like, that's just how blah, blah, blah is.
I've already
just
acknowledged that. So I've already gone through 2 of Danny's steps of grieving your grudge, but I'm still struggling to let go. So take me to step 3 here. What do I do next?
So,
because it's 10 years old and it's still bugging me.
So the part about jealousy, and that if that is intertwined in that somehow,
I think it is.
Then that's because, and I'll shift gears here and not to turn it back to myself, but I am going to turn it back to myself. My grudge against my stepfather was heavily tied to the fact that I felt weak for not having stood up to him when I was 15. When he entered my mom's life and he got married to my mom, and this is 15 months after my dad died, I was happy to have him married to her. When given a chance to say I didn't want it to happen, I didn't speak up. And all throughout my teenage years, when I grew to really resent him and I thought his rules were too strict and I thought he was a dick, and I really did not like living with him, I still didn't rebel. I never told him, you're not my real father, because I didn't want to destabilize my mom's marriage to him. I didn't want to make it harder on her. Then when it turned out that he was an ass and he was reckless and he'd spent through their retirement savings and he'd lost his job as a school superintendent in a really embarrassing way and cheated on her and made her cry.
So once he realized she was crossing her, all bets were off. It wasn't just your grudge anymore.
Then I felt even worse because I was like, I didn't protect my family. I felt even weaker. And now, having gone through therapy, this is the part where that's not on me, man. Like I might feel that, and I'll probably always feel that a little way, but that's like an unrealistic expectation. And I'm going to cut my younger self some slack and just say that, like, hey, that's recognizing that part of it took a lot of the sting out of the being mad, because I was mad at myself.
Yes, forgiveness. You got to forgive yourself first.
And I would say that was one of the major turning points was, no, man, there's nothing I could have done. I was 15. I'm going to keep them from moving to California. I'm going to keep her from marrying him. Like that's unrealistic. And besides, it doesn't even matter. It happened. And so I don't know your relationship with this other author well enough, or even I don't even know you well enough to say whether you're a jealous type, but if there is some sort of feeling of inadequacy that you feel about yourself in comparison to that author, this might be wrapped up in there, and just cutting yourself some slack and saying,
yeah, I wouldn't say it's inadequacy. I think it's more of the, it's even the uglier one. Like maybe the person maybe got a little more recognition than I thought. Like, it's more, it's pettier than that.
Yeah.
It's not like, the one thing I don't lack is self-confidence. I'm self-loathing. I hate myself. The one thing I don't lack is self-confidence. I mean, I think my books are great. That's the only place I love myself is on the page, I mean, I hate this guy that yaps into a mic or in front of an audience, but I'm really secure in that. So it's not relative to like, I don't feel inadequate. I just feel, it's just more that, like, it's the worst kind. It's the worst kind. It's the, well, why does that person get that award and I didn't get it? Or, you know what I mean? That it's like really, it's petty. And I know I can't control that. You know what I mean? I know that I've had, what I've tried to do to cope is just like turn it around. Like whenever I feel that way, like every year when I don't win the Pulitzer Prize, I have a little bit of a, oh, damn, yeah, well, I wasn't even a finalist. I turn it around and say, geez, how many times you got lucky? My God, I had one of the most banned books in America. That's a stroke of luck. You know what I mean? What did I do? I've been trying to rattle cages for 40 years. It didn't do shit. Then some lady in Texas decides to, and then, so that's lucky. I mean, I've been lucky so many times. And the best way, the best tool I've developed to try kind of overcome these like petty grievances of jealousy like that, professional jealousy, are to just remind myself how lucky I've been. And remind myself that there are probably a lot of people that would just harbor that same feeling toward me because I'm higher on the food chain or something like that. So like to put myself, to depersonalize it a little and see myself in this larger continuum sort of helps me realize like, wait, what are you doing? This is dumb. I mean, you're so lucky. Look where you are,
So let's extend that one bit further, because I don't think it's dumb that you would feel envious of another author or feel competitive with that. I think that's really natural. I think that there's the idea of being competitive is, I do think it's part of human nature. And cut yourself some slack for feeling that way. It's not like you act that way. It's not like you have withheld support for other people because you begrudge them success. But even talking now, and hearing how you describe that feeling, you feel that that's a very negative thing. And I think it's just a natural thing.
Oh, that's cool.
We all deal with we all deal with ugly feelings. Like we all have ugly feelings about other people. And by being able to understand what they are and what they mean, I think it helps us to not act on those ugly feelings, which is the most important part, right? But the other thing is we don't need to beat ourselves up for having them. It's part of being human. Like we think some ugly things. And God, look at the animal kingdom. Like revenge is bad. We talked about that, right?
Yeah,
revenge is bad.
I mean, believe me, I've never even
everywhere.
I've never even gone to the point where like, I've never even entertained the possibility of like giving one of these people I begrudge like a 1-star review somewhere or anything like that. That would be so easy to do.
That's proof of how positive it is, of like, cut yourself some slack about having feelings about it.
I appreciate that, buddy. Hey, one of the things when we're talking about your stepdad's relationship, I have to ask because I feel like your mom is sort of the forgotten element of this. Is like, because your grudge started between you and your stepdad, but then it extended to his treatment of your mom, so it became kind of a second party grudge, which really upped the ante on it. But how does your mom talk about that relationship?
So my mom, and this would be, when did I start writing about this? It was right after she died. She died in 2019. She'd had cancer. She'd been diagnosed with cancer about 4 years before that. And she was an incredibly selfless and kind woman who had her husband, my dad, and they had 3 kids. He died when he was 38. And it was really sad. Like she was basically his caretaker for the last 2 years of his life. Then she married this guy who I didn't really like, but I thought was a really good partner to her. And then he broke her heart and really left her in a difficult state. And she kind of troopered on, and she's still really close, or was really close, with all 3 of us, my brother, my sister, and I. And I think one of the reasons that I didn't do anything about my stepfather in those years between the divorce and afterward, I talked about imagining writing about him. I certainly could have. I was a journalist. He was in the papers in the Bay Area. I could have written about not just the professional stuff, but even personal elements of it. I would have never done that because I didn't want to add to her pain. And she did get over him. She told me that she said, I really just don't think about him that much anymore. And that was probably like with 3 or 4 years, like before she had gotten really sick. And he had started smoking the last year. Like when everything was going to hell, he just all of a sudden started smoking, which I thought was freaking hilarious because he was such this high-strung, holier-than-thou, self-righteous dude. We come back on a vacation and he's sneaking a cigarette by the rental car. I thought that was just the most deliciously hilarious. It was like catnip to me. And she hated that he had started smoking that year. And she would say, whenever I start thinking about him, I just tell him to go outside and smoke, which I thought was just the funniest. But she came to a sense of peace about that. And she would say that she always loved him and he screwed it up, but it didn't haunt her. And I was never going to poke that nest while she was alive, because that would have been, and it would be painful for her to hear how difficult her marriage was on me, and the hard feelings I have about him, because she's the one who chose to do that. I believe that I can say that while still having the utmost love and gratitude for my mom. And one of the coolest things that happened toward the end of her life was that I'd been pretty angry at the unfairness of her illness, just that, and she's in her late 60s, she's gone through all this, she should have a time to be happy. But especially during that last week of her life, and she died at home, which is what she wanted, with her 3 kids in the room. We were all there. Whereas I was able to thank her, because she really didn't become a bitter person. She remained this kind and loving woman, this incredibly generous mother who was still close to my dad's family, and they all still love her. Every Thanksgiving we would go to Yosemite to be with them. And I was able to thank her for that, because she did a really good job of raising 3 kids to be very loving. And it would have been very easy for her to become bitter and mean and angry, given what life had dealt her, and she didn't. But for me, once she died, that's when I started poking around at this. And it started as kind of a memoir about my family, and I've got 2, my parents passed away, and I've got the closest thing I have left to a living parent is the stepfather that I don't like. And it's gone through a lot of different iterations to get to where it is. But yeah, I've always felt I wouldn't be writing about this if she was still alive, but I also feel that I wouldn't have been able to get to this point in terms of closure without having to push through some of those feelings.
Man, to hear you talk about your mom just makes me realize it's probably very near the heart of what I've always liked about you, with whether or not I knew about this relationship, is that people that respect their moms are usually really good people. I don't know what it is. I mean, my mom, everything you described about, like, because my stepdad, I didn't have a good relationship with him, but she did nothing but, even though he was not good to her a lot, she was always bigger. I sometimes wonder if it's women, if it's moms, but if they have more of a capacity to forgive. You know, I mean, is this a sexually allocated gender role sort of thing? Have women had to endure so much more than men, dealing with the men's petty egos and their grievances? And I mean, I almost wonder if women have more of a facility to forgive. Although I've seen a few cat fights, and they were as they were as bad as any fight I've seen between 2 men.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would also say that culturally, in terms of what the expectations or sort of gender stereotypes that are used, is holding a grudge is equated with being a tough man, with masculinity, while being able to find closure without punching somebody's lights out is not looked upon as a sign of strength, which I would actually, having gone through it, like, one of the hardest thing I've ever done is to get to a point where, like, I'm not going to be mad at this guy anymore, and I don't need him to say sorry for me to feel that way. I can just let it go. It happened, and I don't need anything else to happen to him to be able to feel better about it. But it's possible that it's not just sort of the gender norms that are responsible for producing that.
Well, as your friend, I'm glad to hear that you're having closure with this. We've been talking to Danny O'Neill, who Grudgery is the name of the newsletter. If somebody wishes to subscribe, they do what?
Go to grudgery.com.
Grudgery.com. If you would like to continue, if you didn't get enough of Grudges in the last 59 minutes, Danny is your guy. You will get a newsletter every day all about grudges. And if you don't, be careful. He may begrudge you. I will, because he's my friend. So I would say get on the newsletter or risk 2 grudges that you don't want, because we have microphones, people. This has been A Fresh Face in Hell, and Danny, as always, you have been a fresh face in hell. Thanks so much, buddy. So appreciated.
I love you, man, and thanks for having me on.
A Fresh Face in Hell with Jonathan Evison is brought to you by Fresh Face TV and produced by Jason Botkin and yours truly. Check us out on Instagram. Find us on YouTube. Like and subscribe. If you love the podcast, by all means, run out and buy all of Jonathan Evason's award-winning novels, available wherever books are sold.